The vast throne room of the Zithar Empire was cold and unwelcoming, with its towering pillars and sharp metallic walls. Captain Jackson Cade, a seasoned human officer, stood among the group of diplomats, his sharp eyes scanning the alien royalty before him. The Zithar king, a tall, imposing figure with an air of authority, stepped forward. His deep voice echoed through the chamber. As a sign of peace between our people, the king declared, "I offer my daughter, Kiri, to the humans." The room fell silent. Jackson's eyebrows shot up, his hand instinctively tightening into a fist. Among the humans present, whispers of confusion spread. Giving a daughter as a gift. It was a custom humans didn't follow. It felt wrong, almost insulting. From behind the king, a young woman stepped forward timidly. She was slender, her pale blue skin almost shimmering under the room's harsh lights. Her silver-white hair flowed down her back, and her soft, delicate features made her look fragile, like a porcelain doll. Her violet eyes darted nervously between the humans and her father, unsure of what to expect. "This is Kiri," the king continued, gesturing toward her. "She has no place here. Weakness cannot survive in the Zithar Empire." Kiri lowered her gaze, her hands clutching the folds of her flowing dress. She didn't argue, didn't even flinch at her father's cruel words. She looked resigned, as though she had heard this all before. Jackson took a step forward, his jaw tightening. He was a soldier, not a diplomat, and he despised these political games. "Why would you send her away?" he asked bluntly, his voice carrying an edge of defiance. The king's sharp gaze turned to Jackson. "She is weak. She shames our lineage. Perhaps the humans can find some use for her." Jackson felt anger bubbling inside him. He didn't like the king's tone, nor did he appreciate being handed someone like a discarded object. Yet he also understood the stakes. Humanity had been negotiating with the Zithar Empire for years, trying to avoid conflict. Refusing this gift might jeopardize everything. The human ambassador leaned in toward Jackson and whispered, "Accept her. We can't risk offending him." Jackson glanced back at Kiri. She still hadn't spoken a word, her head bowed low as if she wanted to disappear. Something about her stirred a flicker of pity in his chest. She wasn't at fault for her father's cruelty. With a deep breath, Jackson nodded. "Fine. She comes with us." The king waved a dismissive hand. "Take her and go. She is no longer my concern." Kiri followed the humans silently as they left the throne room. The spaceship that had brought Jackson and his team waited just outside. As they boarded, Jackson cast a quick glance back at Kiri. She moved slowly, her posture hunched as though trying to shrink herself. She looked so small compared to the towering Zithar guards. Once inside the ship, Jackson guided her to a seat. "You're safe now," he said, though his voice lacked warmth. He didn't know how to feel about this strange new passenger. Kiri looked up at him, her violet eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Fear, sadness, or perhaps it was something deeper, a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson didn't reply. Instead, he turned and walked toward the cockpit, his thoughts a storm of questions. Why had the king treated his own daughter like that? What was Jackson supposed to do with someone so fragile? And more importantly, could she survive among humans, or was this just another political game that would end badly for everyone involved? As the ship lifted off, leaving the Zithar world behind, Jackson couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that this gift was more than it seemed. The spaceship hummed softly as it traveled through the cold void of space. Kiri sat quietly in the corner of the lounge area, her hands resting on her lap. The human crew moved around her, casting curious glances, but saying nothing. She felt like a stranger in a strange place, her presence as awkward as the silence surrounding her. Captain Jackson Cade entered the room, his heavy boots clicking against the metal floor. He carried a steaming cup of coffee, his usual choice during long voyages. His eyes briefly landed on Kiri, who flinched slightly under his gaze. She looked so out of place, a delicate figure in a world built for humans. "You eaten yet?" Jackson asked, his voice neutral but direct. Kiri shook her head, her silver hair catching the soft light. I don't know where to go," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson sighed. He was used to commanding soldiers, not babysitting a timid girl. "Follow me," he said, gesturing toward the mess hall. Kiri stood quickly, her thin frame moving with a hesitant grace. She followed him down the narrow hallway, her footsteps light and almost soundless. As they reached the mess hall, a few crew members looked up, their conversations halting. The atmosphere was heavy with curiosity and mild suspicion. Jackson grabbed a tray and handed it to Kiri. "Pick what you want. Don't worry about them," he said, glancing at the staring crew. His tone carried a silent command. "Back off." Kiri hesitated, her violet eyes scanning the strange human food. Finally, she selected a small portion of what looked like fruit and bread. Jackson nodded and led her to a quiet corner. As Kiri began to eat, Jackson leaned back in his chair, watching her. "You're not what I expected," he said bluntly. She paused, her hands trembling slightly. "What did you expect?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Jackson shrugged. "Not someone who looks like the wind could knock them over." Her cheeks flushed a faint blue, a sign of embarrassment. "I know I'm weak," she said, her gaze dropping to the table. "My father has reminded me of that my whole life." Jackson frowned. He wasn't used to dealing with this kind of vulnerability. "Weakness isn't permanent," he said, his tone less harsh than before. "It's what you do about it that matters." Kiri looked up at him, her eyes reflecting a flicker of hope. No one had ever said that to her before. She nodded slowly, as if trying to believe his words. Suddenly, the ship jolted slightly, and a voice crackled over the intercom. "Captain, we've picked up some movement near Sector 5. Could be debris, but it's close." Jackson stood immediately, his instincts kicking in. "Stay here," he told Kiri before heading to the cockpit. She watched him go, her heart pounding with anxiety. Even though she barely knew him, there was something about his presence that made her feel safe. Minutes later, Jackson returned, his expression tense. "It's nothing serious," he said, noticing the worry on Kiri's face. "Just space junk. Happens all the time." Kiri exhaled softly, relief washing over her. "You're very calm," she said, admiring how he handled the situation. "It's my job," Jackson replied. "You'll get used to it." His words lingered in her mind. Could she ever get used to this world? This world of humans, of strength and confidence? She didn't know, but something inside her stirred, a small voice whispering that she could try. Later that night, Kiri sat alone in the small cabin assigned to her. The stars outside the windows sparkled like tiny gems, their light soothing yet distant. For the first time in years, she felt something other than fear or shame. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And as she lay down to sleep, she silently promised herself that she wouldn't let her father's words define her anymore. She would find her strength, no matter how long it took. The spaceship's engines purred steadily as the crew settled into their routines. Days had passed since Kiri's arrival, but the uneasy silence around her lingered. The humans were polite but distant, unsure how to interact with someone so different. Kiri kept to herself, her quiet nature making her almost invisible. Captain Jackson Cade, however, had been watching her. She wasn't causing trouble, but she wasn't thriving either. He didn't know what he expected when he agreed to take her, but seeing her like this, lost and unsure, bothered him more than he cared to admit. One evening, Jackson found Kiri sitting in the observation deck, staring out at the endless expanse of stars. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her violet eyes reflecting the galaxy's shimmering lights. For a moment, Jackson hesitated. He wasn't great with words, especially when it came to emotions, but he couldn't ignore the sadness radiating from her. "You've been here a week," he said, leaning against the doorway. still staring at stars like they'll give you answers. Kiri turned her head slightly, startled by his presence. "It's peaceful," she replied softly. "It helps me think." Jackson walked over and sat beside her. He wasn't used to sitting still, but something about Kiri made him pause. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "My father, my people. I wonder if they're better off without me." Jackson frowned. "You really believe that?" Kiri nodded, her silver hair falling over her face. "He said I was weak, a failure. That's why he sent me away." Jackson sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I don't know much about your people or your father, but I do know this. You're here now. What you do from here on is up to you, not him." Kyrie's gaze shifted back to the stars. "But I don't know how to be strong like you or your crew. I don't even know where to start." Jackson studied her for a moment. Her words weren't just self-pity. They were genuine. She wanted to change but didn't know how. "Strength isn't just muscles or bravery," he said after a pause. "It's about trying, even when you think you'll fail. You want to learn. Fine, I'll teach you." Her head snapped toward him, her violet eyes wide with surprise. "You will?" Jackson nodded. "But it won't be easy. I don't go easy on anyone." Kiri sat up straighter, a spark of determination flickering in her eyes. "I'll try," she said. "I want to try." The next morning, Jackson led Kiri to the training deck. The space was large and filled with exercise equipment, sparring mats, and a few curious crew members who paused their own routines to watch. "First lesson," Jackson said, tossing a training staff to her. She barely caught it, stumbling under its weight. "Balance. If you can't stand your ground, you've already lost." Kiri nodded, gripping the staff tightly. Jackson demonstrated the basic stance, and she mimicked him, her movements awkward and unsure. He corrected her posture, guiding her step by step. The crew exchanged glances, some whispering among themselves. "She's going to break," one of them muttered. "She doesn't have the strength for this." Jackson shot them a sharp look, silencing their doubts. "Eyes on your own work," he barked. Kiri heard the whispers but focused on Jackson's instructions. Her legs trembled as she held the stance, and sweat began to bead on her forehead. She wanted to quit, but Jackson's voice pushed her forward. "Don't stop," he said firmly. "Pain means you're growing." By the end of the session, Kiri collapsed onto the mat, her arms and legs shaking. But despite the exhaustion, she looked up at Jackson with a small, determined smile. "That wasn't as bad as I thought," she said, panting. Jackson smirked, crossing his arms. "Good, because tomorrow will be worse." Kiri laughed lightly, surprising herself. For the first time, she felt like she had taken a step forward. A small step, but a step nonetheless. As she lay in bed that night, her body sore but her mind clear, Kiri whispered to herself, "I can do this." And somewhere deep inside, she started to believe it. The sound of clashing training staffs echoed through the ship's training deck. Kiri stood in the middle of the room, her breaths coming fast and heavy as she struggled to keep her stance steady. Across from her, Jackson moved with practiced ease, his staff spinning in his hands like it weighed nothing. "Focus," Jackson barked, his voice sharp but not unkind. "You're too stiff. Relax your grip, but keep control." Kiri adjusted her hands, trying to follow his instructions. Her arms ached, and her legs felt like jelly, but she refused to stop. Each day of training pushed her further than she thought possible, and while her body screamed for rest, her determination only grew stronger. Jackson lunged forward, his staff aimed at her side. Kiri yelped and barely managed to block the strike, the impact rattling her arms. "Better," Jackson said, nodding slightly. "But you need to react faster." Again. The crew had gathered at the edges of the room, pretending to work while sneaking glances at the intense training session. At first, they had doubted Kiri, whispering about her weakness and questioning why Jackson bothered. But over the past few days, Those whispers had turned to quiet admiration. She didn't give up, no matter how hard the drills became. Kiri swung her staff in a wide arc, trying to land a hit on Jackson's side. He easily sidestepped, his movements fluid and precise. "Too predictable," he said, smirking. "Think before you strike." Gritting her teeth, Kiri adjusted her stance and tried again. This time, she feinted left before aiming for his shoulder. Jackson blocked the blow, but his smirk faded slightly. "Now you're starting to get it," he said. The session ended with Kiri flat on her back, staring up at the ceiling as her chest heaved for air. Sweat dripped down her face, but there was a small smile on her lips. She was exhausted, but for the first time, she felt like she had earned that exhaustion. Jackson offered her a hand, pulling her to her feet. "You're improving," he said simply. "Keep this up, and you might actually surprise me." Kiri's smile grew, and she nodded. "I'll do better tomorrow," she promised. Later that evening, Kiri sat in the ship's common area, nursing a cup of water as her sore muscles protested every movement. A few crew members approached her cautiously, their expressions less wary than before. "You've been working hard," one of them said, a tall woman named Lyra. "Didn't think you'd last this long." Kiri looked up, unsure how to respond. I just want to be better," she said softly. "I don't want to be a burden anymore." Lyra exchanged a glance with the others and smiled. "You're not a burden. You've got guts. That counts for something." Kiri's cheeks flushed a faint blue, and she nodded shyly. The crew's acceptance, even in small steps, meant more to her than she could say. The next morning, Kiri woke before the ship's alarms, her body sore, but her mind sharp. She made her way to the training deck, where Jackson was already waiting. He leaned against the wall, his arms crossed as he watched her approach. "Early today," he remarked. "I want to be ready," Kiri said, her voice steady. Jackson handed her a training staff and smirked. "Let's see if yesterday's lesson stuck." The two began their drills, and this time, Kiri moved with more confidence. She still stumbled and missed her marks, but her reactions were quicker, her strikes more precise. Jackson pushed her harder, and she met his challenges head-on. By the end of the session, Jackson nodded in approval. "Not bad," he said. "You're starting to think like a fighter." Kiri's chest swelled with pride. For so long, she had believed her father's words, that she was weak and useless. But now, under Jackson's guidance, she was starting to see a different version of herself, one who could be strong. As she left the training deck, her steps were lighter, and her heart was full of hope. This was just the beginning, and for the first time, she believed she could become something more. Kiri's hands tightened around the training staff as she stood in the middle of the ship's sparring ring. Her violet eyes stayed locked on Jackson, who circled her with a confident smirk. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the spaceship's engines and the sound of Kiri's steady breathing. "Last time, you hesitated," Jackson said, his voice calm but firm. "Hesitation will get you killed in a real fight. No thinking, just act. Show me what you've learned." Kiri nodded, her grip firm but relaxed, just as he had taught her. The muscles in her legs burned, but she held her stance, refusing to falter. Around them, a small crowd of crew members had gathered, watching closely. The initial skepticism they had about her had been replaced by genuine interest. Jackson made the first move, lunging forward with his staff aimed at her shoulder. Kiri sidestepped quickly, using her smaller frame to her advantage. She swung her staff in a wide arc, aiming for his side, but Jackson blocked it with ease. "Faster," he barked, stepping back and giving her room to attack again. Kiri adjusted her stance and moved in, her strikes becoming sharper and more precise. She could feel the energy coursing through her, the lessons Jackson had drilled into her finally clicking into place. The sparring session turned into a flurry of movements, staffs clashing, feet shuffling, and Kiri's determination growing with each exchange. Finally, she saw an opening. Feinting to the right, She quickly spun to the left, landing a solid strike against Jackson's side. The crowd let out a collective gasp, followed by a few murmurs of approval. Jackson stepped back, his hand resting on his side where she had hit him. For a moment, he stared at her with an unreadable expression. Then he grinned. "Now that's more like it," he said. "You're starting to fight like you mean it." Kiri lowered her staff, her chest heaving from the effort. A small smile crept onto her face, and for the first time, she felt like she belonged. The crew around her clapped lightly, a sign of their growing respect. Later that day, Kiri sat with Lyra and a few other crew members in the common area. The once intimidating humans now treated her like one of their own, sharing stories and laughing together. It felt strange to Kiri, this warmth, this camaraderie, but it also felt good. "Never thought I'd see Jackson take a hit in a sparring match," Lyra said, smirking as she nudged Kiri's arm. "You're full of surprises." Kiri blushed faintly, her cheeks turning a soft shade of blue. "It's only because he's teaching me," she said modestly. "I still have a lot to learn." "That's the attitude," Lyra said. "But don't sell yourself short. You're tougher than you think." Kiri glanced around at the smiling faces of the crew. They had accepted her in a way her own people never had. It made her heart swell with a mixture of gratitude and determination. She didn't just want to survive anymore. She wanted to prove that she could stand on her own. That night, Jackson found Kiri back in the training deck, practicing alone. Her movements were slower than during their sparring match, her body clearly exhausted, but her focus was unwavering. "You should be resting," Jackson said, leaning against the doorway. Kiri paused, turning to face him. "I can't stop," she said. "Not yet. I want to get better." Jackson studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right," he said, stepping into the room and picking up a staff. "But if you're going to train, do it right. Let's go over your footwork again." Kiri smiled, grateful for his continued support. As they trained late into the night, she realized that this was what she had been missing her whole life. Someone who believed in her, even when she doubted herself. And for the first time, she believed she could become more than her father's discarded daughter. She could become someone strong. The atmosphere aboard the ship had shifted. Where Kiri once felt like an outsider, she now found herself at the center of attention. The crew had grown fond of her, admiring her determination and the progress she had made. Even Jackson, who rarely showed emotion, seemed impressed, though he never said it outright. But the challenges weren't over yet. One evening, as the ship neared a supply station for refueling, an emergency alarm blared through the corridors. Red lights flashed, and the crew scrambled to their stations. Kiri, startled, ran toward the command deck, her heart pounding. "What's happening?" she asked, finding Jackson standing at the helm, his face tense. "Pirates," Jackson said, his voice grim. "They've been tracking us and picked now to attack. They're after our cargo, and probably our ship." Kiri's stomach twisted. She had heard of pirates, ruthless criminals who preyed on vulnerable ships in space. "What can I do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear creeping in. Jackson glanced at her, surprised by her question. "Stay out of the way," he said. "This isn't your fight." Kiri bristled at his words but said nothing. Instead, she followed him to the armory, where the crew armed themselves. Lyra handed Kiri a small energy pistol, her expression serious. "You'll need this," Lyra said, "just in case." Kiri nodded, her fingers tightening around the weapon. It felt foreign and heavy in her hands, but she refused to let her fear show. The pirate's ship latched onto the human vessel like a parasite, cutting through the hull with precision. Within minutes, the sound of metal groaning and distant shouting filled the air. The crew spread out, preparing to defend their ship. Jackson led a team toward the cargo hold, where the pirates were likely to strike first. Kiri followed closely, her steps quiet but purposeful. Jackson noticed her and frowned. "I told you to stay back," he said, his tone sharp. "I can help," Kiri insisted, her voice firm. You trained me for this. Jackson opened his mouth to argue but stopped. There was a fire in her violet eyes he hadn't seen before, a determination he couldn't ignore. With a curt nod, he motioned for her to stay behind him. The first wave of pirates burst into the cargo hold, their weapons drawn. Jackson and his team moved swiftly, engaging them in a fierce firefight. Kiri stayed low, her heart racing as energy blasts lit up the room. She watched Jackson fight, his movements precise and unrelenting, and she knew she couldn't just stand there. When one of the pirates broke away and charged toward her, Kiri's training kicked in. She raised her pistol and fired, the shot grazing the pirate's arm. He stumbled, surprised by her quick reaction, and she followed up with a strike from the butt of her pistol, knocking him out cold. The crew around her noticed and cheered, their confidence bolstered by her bravery. Jackson glanced back, a flicker of pride crossing his face. Not bad, he muttered, before returning to the fight. The battle raged on, but the tide turned in the humans' favor. Kiri continued to hold her ground, her movements growing more confident with each encounter. By the time the pirates retreated, leaving behind their wounded and damaged ship, the crew was victorious, and Kiri had proven herself in a way no one expected. As the crew celebrated in the aftermath, Jackson approached Kiri. She was sitting on a crate, her face streaked with dirt, but her eyes shining with pride. You didn't listen, Jackson said, though his tone lacked the usual harshness. I couldn't just hide, Kiri replied. Not after everything you taught me. Jackson smirked, crossing his arms. You did well, he admitted. Better than some of the crew, even. Kiri's cheeks turned a faint blue at the compliment. Thank you, she said, her voice soft but sincere. As the ship resumed its journey, Kiri sat alone in her cabin, reflecting on the day. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting, contributing, and earning her place among the humans. For the first time, she felt truly alive. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The ship's corridors were alive with activity. Repairs from the pirate attack were underway, and the crew moved with a renewed sense of purpose. The victory had brought them closer together, and Kiri was now seen as an integral part of the team. She wasn't just the frail daughter of an alien king anymore. She was one of them. Jackson stood in the command deck, his arms crossed as he studied the star charts. He had been thinking about Kiri ever since the battle. Her transformation over the past weeks had been nothing short of remarkable. She had gone from a timid outcast to a fighter who could hold her own. As if summoned by his thoughts, Kiri walked onto the deck. Her posture was straighter now, her steps more confident. She no longer looked like someone trying to disappear into the background. You wanted to see me? She asked. Jackson nodded, gesturing for her to step closer. We're heading toward a neutral station for supplies. It's usually safe, but I want you to stay alert. Not everyone out there will see you the way we do. Kiri tilted her head, a hint of curiosity in her violet eyes. You mean because I'm not human? Jackson's expression softened slightly. Something like that. Some people out there won't care how far you've come. They'll only see what you are, not who you are. Kiri nodded slowly, understanding his warning. I'll be careful, she promised. But I won't hide. Jackson smirked, his approval subtle but genuine. Good. When the ship docked at the station, the crew disembarked to rest and resupply. The station was a bustling hub of activity, filled with travelers from countless species. For Kiri, it was a dazzling mix of sights and sounds. Her own world had been rigid and cold, but here, everything seemed alive. As the crew split up to handle their tasks, Kiri found herself wandering the market area. She stayed close to Lyra, who had become something of a friend. The two moved from stall to stall, examining strange artifacts, colorful fabrics, and exotic foods. Kiri stopped at one stall that displayed handcrafted weapons. She ran her fingers over the smooth handle of a dagger, its blade etched with intricate patterns. Beautiful, isn't it? The merchant said, his voice deep and gravelly. Kiri nodded. It is. What's it made of? Zithar steel, the merchant replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. Rare material. You've got a good eye. Kyrie's heart skipped a beat. Zithar steel was a prized resource from her homeworld, and she recognized the craftsmanship instantly. The realization made her feel both proud and uneasy. Her people had created this, yet she had been cast out as though she had no value. Before she could respond, a shadow fell over her. Two burly figures loomed nearby, their expressions unfriendly. What's a Zithar doing here? One of them sneered, his tone laced with disdain. Lyra stepped in front of Kiri, her hand resting on the pistol at her side. She's with us, she said firmly. Back off. The men exchanged glances but didn't move. Zithars think they're better than everyone else. The second one said, maybe she needs to be taught a lesson. Kiri felt a surge of fear, but quickly suppressed it. She wasn't the same scared girl who had been sent away by her father. Stepping forward, she met the men's glares with calm determination. I don't want trouble, she said, but I'm not afraid of you. The men hesitated, clearly surprised by her composure. Before they could respond, Jackson's voice cut through the tension. Is there a problem here? The men turned to see Jackson approaching, his expression cold and dangerous. They muttered something under their breath before walking away, their bravado vanishing under his gaze. Kiri exhaled slowly as Jackson looked at her. You handled that well, he said. But next time, don't wander off without backup. Lyra grinned, clapping Kiri on the shoulder. You've got guts. I'll give you that. Kiri smiled faintly, her confidence bolstered by their support. The encounter had shaken her, but it also proved something important. She wasn't the weak, helpless girl her father had abandoned. She was stronger now, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. As they returned to the ship, Kiri felt a new sense of purpose. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was learning, growing, and becoming someone she could be proud of. The ship moved quietly through the vastness of space, its destination set for Earth. Kiri stood on the observation deck, her hands resting on the railing, as she gazed out at the endless stars. Her reflection in the glass was no longer that of the timid girl who had left the Zithar Empire. She had changed. Her stance was steady, her gaze clear, and her heart filled with a determination she had never known before. But her journey wasn't over. Jackson approached, his presence a steady comfort she had come to rely on. We'll reach Earth in 2 days, he said, standing beside her. You ready for that? Kiri nodded slowly. I think so. But what happens when we get there? What's my place in your world? Jackson crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on the stars. Your place is what you make of it. You've already proven yourself to the crew, and to me. That's more than most people can say. Kiri turned to face him, her violet eyes searching his face. Do you think my father ever expected this? That I could become someone strong? Jackson smirked. No, but that doesn't matter. This isn't about him anymore. It's about you. Her chest swelled with pride at his words. For so long, she had measured herself against her father's harsh standards. Now she realized she didn't need his approval. She could define her own worth. The next day, a distress signal interrupted the calm of their journey. The crew gathered on the command deck as Jackson studied the incoming message. It was faint, barely readable, but the coordinates indicated it was coming from a small Zithar vessel nearby. It could be a trap, Lyra said, her hand resting on her weapon. Pirates could have set it up to lure us in. Or it could be someone who actually needs help, Kiri said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, her tone firm. We can't just ignore it. Jackson considered her words, his brow furrowed. Finally, he nodded. We'll approach cautiously. Kiri, you're with me. The crew prepared for the mission, arming themselves and readying the ship's shuttle. As they approached the stranded vessel, the faint signal grew stronger. The ship was small and heavily damaged, its exterior riddled with scorch marks from energy blasts. Jackson and Kiri boarded the vessel carefully, their weapons drawn. The interior was dark, the air thick with the smell of burnt metal. Kiri's heart raced as she followed Jackson through the narrow corridors. "Over here," Jackson called, pointing to a figure slumped against the wall. It was a Zithar woman, her breathing shallow and her pale blue skin marred with cuts and bruises. Kiri rushed to her side, her hands trembling as she checked for signs of life. "She's alive," Kiri said, relief flooding her voice. But barely. The woman's eyes fluttered open, and she stared at Kiri with a mix of fear and recognition. You're the king's daughter," she whispered, her voice weak. Kiri froze. She hadn't heard herself called that in weeks, and the words felt foreign now. "I was," she said softly. "But that doesn't matter now. You're safe." The woman's gaze shifted to Jackson, her expression wary. "Humans. They're here to help," Kiri said firmly. "Trust me." The woman nodded faintly, her body relaxing as Kiri and Jackson lifted her onto a stretcher. They carried her back to their ship, where the crew quickly tended to her injuries. Later, as the Zithar woman rested in the medical bay, Kiri sat beside her. The woman's story was tragic. Her ship had been attacked by the same pirates who had ambushed Jackson's crew. She had barely escaped with her life. "You saved me," the woman said, her voice trembling. "Why?" Kiri met her gaze, her expression kind but resolute. "Because I know what it's like to feel abandoned. No one deserves that." The woman's eyes filled with gratitude, and for the first time, Kiri felt a deep sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting to make a difference, for her people, for humanity, and for anyone who had ever been cast aside. As the ship continued toward Earth, Kiri sat with Jackson, a quiet strength radiating from her. She wasn't just surviving now, she was thriving. And she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them head-on. Because she wasn't weak anymore, she was powerful, and she had earned every bit of it. The ship descended through Earth's atmosphere, its hull glowing faintly from the heat. Kiri stood at the viewport, her heart pounding as the blue and green planet came into view. This was her new home, a world unlike the one she had left behind. She felt a mix of excitement and uncertainty, but one thing was clear: she was ready to face whatever came next. Jackson approached her, his arms crossed as he watched her quietly. "Nervous?" he asked. Kiri turned to him, a faint smile on her lips. "A little," she admitted, "but it's a good kind of nervous." Jackson nodded. "Earth can be overwhelming at first, but you'll adapt. You've already proven you can handle more than most." His words filled her with a quiet confidence. She had come a long way from the fragile girl her father had discarded. Now she was strong, capable, and ready to forge her own path. The ship landed smoothly at a secure human outpost. As the crew disembarked, Kiri took in her surroundings. The sky was bright, the air crisp, and the ground beneath her feet felt solid and real. She had spent so much time in space that being on a planet again felt strange, almost surreal. The crew was greeted by officials who had come to receive the cargo and debrief Jackson. As the others went about their duties, Kiri lingered near the edge of the landing platform, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "You're quiet," Lyra said, walking up beside her. "Everything okay?" Kiri nodded. "It's just different. Beautiful, but different." Lyra grinned. "You'll get used to it. And trust me, Earth has a lot to offer." Kiri smiled, appreciating the warmth in Lyra's tone. For the first time, she felt like she belonged, not because of who she was supposed to be, but because of who she had become. Later that day, Jackson led Kiri to a training facility within the outpost. The space was large and well-equipped, filled with humans training in various forms of combat and strategy. Kiri's eyes widened as she watched them, her heart racing with excitement. "You've made a lot of progress," Jackson said as they entered. "But this is where the real work begins." Kiri turned to him, her determination shining in her violet eyes. "I'm ready." Jackson handed her a practice staff, a small smirk on his face. "Let's see how much you've really learned." The two stepped onto the sparring mat, drawing the attention of several onlookers. Carrie held her stance, her grip firm and steady. Jackson made the first move, lunging forward with a quick strike. Carrie blocked it with ease, her movements smooth and precise. The sparring match intensified, the sound of clashing staffs echoing through the room. Carrie moved with agility and confidence, her strikes calculated and her defenses strong. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was thinking, planning, and executing with skill. Finally, she saw an opening and took it, disarming Jackson with a swift and unexpected move. The practice staff clattered to the ground, and the room erupted in applause. Jackson stared at her for a moment, then laughed. "Looks like I taught you too well." Carrie grinned, her chest swelling with pride. "I had a good teacher." The onlookers approached, congratulating Carrie and asking about her training. For the first time, she felt truly accepted, not as the Zithar King's daughter, but as herself. That evening, as the sun set over the outpost, Carrie stood outside, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. Jackson joined her, his expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way," he said. "But this is just the beginning." Carrie nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I know, but I'm not afraid anymore." Jackson smirked. "Good. Because something tells me you're going to change more than just your own life. You've got what it takes to make a real difference." Carrie smiled, her heart full of hope and determination. For the first time, she wasn't defined by her past or her father's words. She was free to be who she wanted to be. And as the stars began to shine above, Carrie silently vowed to use her strength to help others, to be the warrior she had always known she could become.